Good evening. I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America. On behalf of our chair, Betsy Smith, and our trustees and staff, welcome. In May 1982, the Morgan Library hosted a party to launch a somewhat audacious new venture, a nonprofit publisher and cultural institution dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the American literary tradition a vital part of the culture. 40 years and over 12 million books later, here we are tonight, thanks in large part to the loyal friends and gifted colleagues in the room tonight. It's a privilege to know you and work with you, and a great pleasure to celebrate this milestone with you. We owe special thanks to Betsy Smith and our extraordinary Board of Trustees. If the trustees who are here could stand briefly. We're indebted to Scholastic, Penguin Random House, and our other corporate sponsors, and to this evening's benefactors, James Basker, Ron Daniel and Lisa Scott, Andrew Hedden, Alan Klein, Edwin and Patricia Matthews, Elihu and Susan Rose, Betsy Smith, Amy Davidson Sorkin and David Sorkin, and Daniel and Sandra Weiss. We are deeply grateful for your generous support of Library of America's mission and this anniversary celebration. There's a lot to celebrate together. This fall, we'll publish the 375th volume in the Library of America series, a definitive edition of William Faulkner's collected stories, and a season that also includes Don DeLillo, playwright Adrian Kennedy, a fresh look at 1960s crime thrillers, and a revelatory collection of Black writers from the founding era. More readers turn to Library of America books today than ever before, including, thanks to donor-supported initiatives, students and teachers in underfunded schools, reading groups at correctional facilities, and patrons at hundreds of public libraries nationwide. LOA Live, our series of online programs launched 3 years ago, reaches thousands of viewers in all 50 states and 72 countries and territories around the world. We're also embarked on our most ambitious public humanities project to date. Latino Poetry, Places to Call Home, funded by an NEH Special Chairman's Award and anchored by a groundbreaking new anthology edited by poet and scholar Rigoberto Gonzalez, is a multi-channel partnership with libraries, museums, and arts organizations nationwide. The initiative will bring people together in person and online to celebrate Latino poems and explore what they can tell us about the richness and the complexity of America's past and the capacious possibilities of our future. It's an example of how, over the past 4 decades, Library of America has grown into a body of essential writing with a gathering power to illuminate what's going on within us and around us, to help us make sense of our lives as people and as a people. One of the many books we can't keep in stock is series volume 98, James Baldwin's collected essays. In the ongoing reckoning about racial justice in America, readers in unprecedented numbers are turning to it as a guide to true north. Library of America looks to its 5th decade with wind in its sails, thanks to the dedication of our readers and friends. We'll continue to expand America's National Library with exciting and revelatory volumes that honor the multivocal, democratic spirit of American writing, always with a scrupulous commitment to literary and editorial excellence. And will continue to reach a widening audience with programs, informative, entertaining, sometimes deeply moving, that offer opportunities to understand and explore the inexhaustibly rich content of the books, our American contribution to the deepest human expression. There's exciting work ahead. Tonight, we mark how far we've come. With grateful acknowledgement of the indispensable partnership of all of you here. Readers, writers, scholars, publishing partners, subscribers, members, patrons, friends. You've not only helped make the first 40 years possible, you've made them a deeply rewarding and exhilarating journey. This evening is by way of saying thanks, and here's to the next 40. And speaking of indispensable partners, without initial seed funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, there would be no Library of America. NEH grants have supported many Library of America projects since then, publishing and public programming initiatives that have made it possible for hundreds of thousands of Americans to experience the transformative power of great American writing. It's just one small part of the crucial work that NEH does. Please join me in welcoming and thanking the chair of NEH, Shelly Lowe.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Max, for that wonderful introduction and for the invitation to come speak tonight. What a momentous evening. Yat she Shelly Lowe yenishia bilagana neshle nanasteja tachini bashchi bilagana dashache do trabaha dashanale lo kantiel de nasha do Washington Dishigan. My name is Shelly Lowe. I am Navajo. I'm originally from Ganado, Arizona. I'm chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I live and work in Washington, D.C. It is such a pleasure to be with everyone here tonight as we celebrate the 40th anniversary of Library of America. And as Max said, what began in 1979 with seed funding from NEH and the Ford Foundation is now a treasure trove of the nation's stories, beautifully told. If you're in this room tonight, you know the power of stories. You know that a novel or a poem or a memoir can change the world. Books can lift us up. They can speak to us in words so intimate, so perfectly phrased, they seem to be written just for us. Books can leave us in tears or make us laugh, or bring a smile to our face, eager as we are to share what we've just read, what's awakened in us something we'd long forgotten. Over the years, NEH has supported a number of phenomenal Library of America projects, including World War I and America, the anthology of letters and archival materials documenting diverse perspectives on the war, accompanied by a traveling exhibition and public programs. NEH has also funded Lift Every Voice, Why African American Poetry Matters Today, an anthology and outreach series exploring 250 years of African American poetry, and of course, most recently, 400 years of Latino poetry, another groundbreaking poetry anthology and national outreach program, which launches this fall. And as long as there are stories to tell and books to read, we'll be here to help organizations like Library of America tell them. One of my favorite writers is Joy Harjo of the Muskogee Creek Nation, former U.S. Poet Laureate. In a 2020 interview in the Chicago Review of Books, she described the power of poetry. She states, "Poetry can hold joy and awe. Poetry can hold the contradictory parts of ourselves, the contradictory parts of the country. Sometimes 3 or 4 little lines can hold a whole lifetime. I can't help but wonder how many lifetimes 40 years of Library of America books can hold. With every line, with every page, you are inspiring readers. You are bringing people closer together. You are helping to tell stories. And that is an act of courage. That is an act of love." I want to congratulate Library of America for 40 years of amazing work, and I'm just so glad we're here to celebrate tonight.
Thank you, Chair Lowe. Our 6 very distinguished speakers tonight show what it means to have a living literary tradition. Public intellectuals and scholars, journalists and filmmakers, novelists and playwrights and performing artists, each one's work has been shaped, inspired, and provoked by the genius of American writers who preceded them, to whom they offer brief tributes this evening. Henry Louis Gates reinvented the field of African American studies, then went on to reinvent the role of public intellectual for our time. Historian, memoirist, literary and cultural critic, editor, screenwriter, and producer, his work spans the university, publishing and journalism, documentary filmmaking, and a hit television series, Finding Your Roots, which delivers on a characteristically Gatesian aspiration to tell riveting stories for an audience of over 25 million viewers that illuminate the complex history of race and identity in America. A Library of America trustee since 1997, he is the editor of the definitive Library of America edition of Frederick Douglass's autobiographies and co-editor of volumes devoted to slave narratives, to the writings of Albert Murray, and to W.E.B. Du Bois's seminal history, Black Reconstruction. Please welcome Henry Louis Gates.
Thank you. You know, I almost didn't make it because this morning I happen to be the director of the Hutchins Center at Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. It's my day job. And Glenn Hutchins is one of the owners of the Celtics. And the first night of the playoff, the next round of the playoff, happens tonight. In fact, it's at 7:30. And when I woke up, there was an email from my friend Glenn saying that he had an extra seat courtside. So for a second, I was going to call in sick, Adam, until I realized that 1 million people would see me in the middle of the court, since these seats are right by the opponent's bench. And whenever I go with them, you get texts all game. Is that you? Is that you? I go, yes, that's me. That's me. I thought I would talk about, give you one example. Again, my day job, I have a PhD in English literature, and I teach literature. That's what I was trained to do. What makes for a literary tradition? Why can Farah and I say that there is an African-American literary tradition? Is it because the writers are all black? Well, that doesn't seem to be a sufficient definition. What if there were a formal principle that connects texts into a tradition so that there is a process of reading and revision, like links in a chain of signification? And I want to give you an example of how one of them works. Probably the most famous paragraph in the history of African American literature was published in 1903 by the great W.E.B. Du Bois, first black man to get a PhD from Harvard University in 1895. And in The Souls of Black Folk, the Bible for black intellectuals, he says, after the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. Now, obviously for Du Bois, this double consciousness is a problem, right? And it's a problem that's produced by Jim Crow segregation. Remember, he publishes this in 1903. So the cure for Du Bois would be, the cure for this double consciousness, this sense of alienation from oneself, if you're black, would be the end of segregation. Funny thing happens in the life of a trope. It goes where it wants to go. For subsequent Black writers, particularly the one that I'm featuring tonight, Zora Neale Hurston, the trope of double consciousness is not a problem, but a solution. She realized that what Du Bois was describing was the condition of modernity itself, that we all have multiple identities. And the key was to learn how to name one's multiple identities and then to move seamlessly between one's multiple identities. And Hurston uses this as a structuring principle for her great novel, Their Eyes Are Watching God, which is about the liberation of a woman who's being oppressed by a series of men. So I'm going to let her explain to you how she flips Du Bois's trope upside down, and we're going to walk with Janie while she frees herself. You sure loves to tell me what to do, but I can't tell you nothing I see. That's because you need telling, her husband rejoined hotly. It would be pitiful if I didn't. Somebody got to think for women and chillin' and chickens and cows. God, they sure don't think none themselves. I know a few things, and women folks think sometimes too. Oh, no, they don't, her husband said. They just think they's thinking. When I see one thing, I understands 10. You see 10 things, and you don't understand one. Time and scenes like that put Janie to thinking about the inside state of her marriage. Time came when she fought back with her tongue as best she could. But it didn't do her any good. It just made Joe, her husband, do more. He wanted her submission, and he'd keep on fighting until he felt he had it. So gradually, Janie pressed her teeth together and learned to hush. The spirit of the marriage left the bedroom and took to living in the parlor. It was there to shake hands whenever company came to visit, but it never went back inside the bedroom again. So she put something in there to represent the spirit like a Virgin Mary image of a church. The bed was no longer a daisy field for her and Joe to play in. It was a place where she went and laid down when she was sleepy and tired. She wasn't petal open anymore with him. She was 24 and 7 years married when she knew. She found that out one day when he slapped her face in the kitchen. It happened over one of those dinners that chasten all women sometimes. They plan and they fix and they do, and then some kitchen-dwelling fiend slips a squatchy, soggy, tasteless mess into their pots and pans. Janie was a good cook, and Joe had looked forward to his dinner as a refuge from other things. So when the bread didn't rise, and the fish wasn't quite done at the bone, and the rice was scorched, he slapped Janie until she had a ringing sound in her ears and told her about her brains before he stalked on back to the store. Janie stood where he left her for unmeasured time and thought. She stood there until something fell off the shelf inside her. Then she went inside there to see what it was. It was her image of Jody tumbled down and shattered. But looking at it, she saw that it never was the flesh and blood figure of her dreams, just something she had grabbed up to drape her dreams over. In a way, she turned her back upon the image where it lay and looked further. She had no more blossoming openings dusting pollen over her man, neither any glistening young fruit where the petals used to be. She found that she had a host of thoughts that she'd never expressed to him, and numerous emotions she had never let Jody know about. Things packed up and put away in parts of her heart where he could never find them. She was saving up feelings for some man she had never seen. She had an inside and an outside now, and suddenly she knew how not to mix them. She bathed, a baptism scene for a new birth. She bathed and put on a fresh dress and head kerchief and went on to the store before Jody had time to send for her. That was a bow to the outside of things. So now she can navigate and move seamlessly between these selves, the inside and the outside. And this, Max, is a killer. This is how she slays the man who has been oppressing her and finds her liberation. And then I will be done. It got to be terrible in the store. The more his back ached and his muscle dissolved into fat and the fat melted off his bones, the more fractious he became with Janie, especially in the store. The more people in there, the more ridicule he poured over her body to point attention away from his own. And so one day, Steve Bixson wanted some chewing tobacco, and Janie cut it wrong. She hated that tobacco knife anyway. It worked very stiff. She fumbled with the thing and cut away from the mark. Mixon didn't mind. He held it up for a joke to tease Janie a little. Look here, Brother Mayor, what your wife done took and done. It was cut comical. So everybody laughed at it. A woman and a knife, no kind of knife, don't belong together. There was some more good-natured laughter at the expense of women. Jody didn't laugh. He hurried across from the post office side and took the plug of tobacco away from Mixon and cut it again, cut it exactly on the mark and glared at Janie. I God almighty, a woman stay around the store till she gets old as Methuselah and still can't cut a little thing like a plug of tobacco? Don't stand there rolling your pop eyes at me with your rump hanging nearly to your knees. A big laugh started out in the store, but people got to thinking and stopped. It was funny if you looked at it right quick, but it got pitiful if you thought about it a while. It was like somebody snatched off a part of a woman's clothes while she wasn't looking and the streets were crowded. And then, too, Janie took the middle of the floor to talk right into Jody's face. And that was something that she hadn't done before. Stop mixing up my doings with my looks, Jody. When you get through telling me how to cut a plug of tobacco, then you can tell me whether my behind is on straight or not. What? What's that you say, Janie? You must be out of your head. No, I ain't out of my head neither. You must be talking such language as that. You the one started talking under people's clothes, not me. What's the matter with you, know-how? You ain't no young girl to be getting all insulted about your looks. You ain't no young courting gal. You're an old woman, nearly 40. Yeah, Janie says. I'm nearly 40, and you's already 50. How come you can't talk about that sometimes instead of always pointing at me? Tain't no use in getting all mad, Janie, because I mentioned you ain't no young gal no more. Nobody in here ain't looking for no wife out of you, old as you is. Nah, I ain't no young gal no more, but then I ain't no old woman neither. And I reckon I looks my age, too. But I'm a woman every inch of me, and I know it. That's a whole lot more than you could say. You big bellies around here and put out a lot of brag, but tain't nothing to it but your big voice. Talking about me looking old, when you pull down your britches, you look like the change of life. Great God from Zion, Sam Watson gasped. Y'all really playing the dozens tonight. What's that you say? Joe challenged, hoping his ears had fooled him. And in the greatest synesthesia in the history of African American literature, Walter says, you heard her, you ain't blind. I'd rather be shot with tacks than to hear that about myself. Lies Moss commiserated. Then Joe Starks realized all the meanings, and his vanity bled like a flood. Janie had robbed him of his illusion of irresistible maleness that all men cherish, which was terrible. The thing that Saul's daughter had done to David. But Janie had done worse. She had cast down his empty armor before men, and they had laughed, would keep on laughing. When he paraded his possessions hereafter, they would not consider the two together. They'd look with envy at the things and pity the man that owned those things. When he said in judgment it would be the same, good-for-nothings like Dave and Lum and Jim wouldn't change place with him. For what can excuse a man in the eyes of other men for lack of courage, lack of strength? Raggedy behind skirts of 16 and 17 would be giving him their merciless pity out of their eyes while their mouths said something humble. There was nothing to do in life anymore. Ambition was useless. And the cruel deceit of Janie, making all that show of humbleness and scorning him all the time, laughing at him and now putting the town up to do the same. Joe Starks didn't know the words for all this, but he knew the feeling. So he struck Janie with all his might and drove her from the store. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Skip, very much. After joining the New Yorker in 1986 as art critic, Adam Gopnik has gone on to write brilliantly about, well, everything. He's illuminated for us Mark Twain, Mark Rothko, Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln Steffens, Charles Darwin, Charles Schultz, Henry James, James Thurber, and baseball writer Bill James. In addition to his acclaimed essays and books, he has turned his hand to children's fantasy literature, a musical, and this past year, an acting role in the Oscar-nominated film Tar. Whatever he's explaining, cities or food or literature or politics or painting or clothes or the million other things we're lucky that he's paid attention to, Adam is one of the most insightful, most astute, and most elegant writers we have. As Library of America trustee since 2016, he has edited series volumes devoted to S.J. Perelman and Richard Wilbur's translations of Molière, and a collection of American writers on Paris. Please welcome Adam Gopnik.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. And you realize, Skip, I'm a boy from Philadelphia, so we have a conflict tonight. I can still name the entire 76ers team from 1967 that beat the Celtics for the championship. Your memory doesn't go back that far. I'm significantly older, actually. I will try and be brief and succinct tonight in celebrating Library of America. Library of America, among countless other things it has done, brings together two of my peculiar citizenships. One is citizenship in the New Yorker magazine, where I have worked and written for the past 40 years, and the other is adopted citizenship in the country of France and in the world of Paris. And those two things may seem somewhat far removed, but as is worth remembering at any time when we celebrate Library of America, Library of America began as a dream in the head and mind of one of my greatest predecessors, Edmund Wilson. And it began as a dream in the mind and imagination of Edmund Wilson exactly because Edmund Wilson was simultaneously a great patriot of American letters and a great cosmopolitan deeply in love with France. And he had realized that in France, the Pléiades series, which had begun then and continues on to this day, had done something that had never been done for American literature. And that was to create a series of uniform volumes, uniformly edited, uniformly issued, that would get all of French literature in an easily available form, all that was essential of French literature, I should say, in an easily and readily available and uniform edition. And Wilson wrote at length and often about the need for the same thing to happen in America. So it was exactly his cosmopolitan knowledge of what was possible and necessary in French literature that fed his powerful sense of American patriotism. Because what we tend to forget too easily is the degree to which Wilson's generation had to make the fight for American literature as a primary literature, not as a secondary or derivative literature, but as a literature that could stand on its own alongside English literature or French literature or the literature of any other language. We take that for granted now, but we forget the act of moral heroism that was required for Wilson's generation, Wilson himself, but forgotten figures like Van Wyck Brooks as well, to put the case that not only was the American literature of the 20th century, the literature of Hemingway and Faulkner, and which had obviously come to dominate center stage, but the literature that preceded it, the writing of Twain, the writing of Dickinson, and above all, the writing of Herman Melville, which had utterly changed the world. I found out only very recently, in terms of making these constellation-like connections, that the great French filmmaker Jean-Pierre Melville had named nothing like Melville, but had taken Melville's name at the height of the occupation as a sign of his commitment to our Melville's existential vision. That was the brew in which the vision of Library America, that was the primordial soup in which the vision of American literature that Library of America exemplifies began. Exactly in the mixture of an inspiration from France and an enormously patriotic impulse of a powerful and salubrious kind here. It informs the work of the Library of America, I believe, right to the present moment. Let me just speak quickly about those 2 volumes, 3 volumes actually, that Max mentioned. that I've been engaged in the past couple of years. They are, by the original standards of Wilson's vision, somewhat eccentric. One was the collected works of S.J. Perelman, certainly a humorist and a satirist of the first rank who Wilson keenly admired. Wilson once said of Perelman, "Sid is the only writer at the New Yorker who somehow escapes the dead hand of the copy editor, and I don't know how he does it." Words which I have emblazoned above my desk in my perpetual struggles to do the same. But Perelman was not the kind of writer who Wilson and his coevals had in mind necessarily when they began it. They were thinking of Melville and Twain. They weren't thinking of Perelman, and yet Perelman's work as a satirist fits and slots perfectly into the ever-expanding sense of what the canon is that the Library of America is devoted to exploring. And then the other two volumes that, with the brilliant help of John Kulka and the entire staff, the editorial staff of Library of America, which is of inestimable value to any harried and overworked author with a tendency to misspellings and misdatings, and I bless their assistance. The other volume was 2 volumes of a 17th century playwright working in an absolutist court, Molière, as translated by a major American poet in the 1940s and 1950s, Richard Wilbur. Once again, that was a volume that I think would have fallen even outside of Wilson's purview and his sense of what a Library of America ought to do. But what Perelman and Wilbur have in common is that they are both great readers. And Perelman's work, as I tried to explain in the introduction I wrote for our anthology, is above all a record of reading, the record of a Jewish kid growing up in Providence, Rhode Island, who read everything, French, English, Italian, and created an entire fantasy world for himself out of everything he had read, which he then offered to us in revised and constantly amended and beautifully Baroque and distended form throughout his life. Wilbur was a GI who came upon European culture at the moment of its absolute crisis, when it seemed to be breaking apart at the end of the Second World War, and like so many of that heroic GI generation of writers, decided that he had to preserve and literally translate some part of it to bring to America at a moment of our cultural ascension. So he went about the task of translating Molière into rhyme, which, believe it or not, had never previously been attempted by any English-speaking translator. Molière is written in rhyme, of course, but no one had seen the necessity of it. It was a genuinely heroic act, and its purpose, as I explained in an essay in the New Yorker not long ago, and I think I was invited onto the board of Library of America exactly to encourage my endless production of essays about writers whom the Library of America has decided to canonize. As I tried to explain, Wilbur's infatuation with rhyme and his desire to make Molière's particular kind of comedy of manners newly accessible to American audiences in the 40s and 50s was not in any sense an academic exercise, but it helped create and seed the great renaissance of rhyming verse, which continues to delight us in everything from the work of Phyllis McGinley to the great masterpieces of our much-missed Stephen Sondheim. Both Perelman and Wilbur are readers who become writers. And for those of us who are readers, who are writers, they are enormously cheering. But they also persist and exist for us of examples of how the cosmopolitan spirit feeds genuine American patriotism, of how a love and a relish for cultures and languages outside our own feeds and enriches our love for everything that is indigenous and native to these shores and to our language. We live in a moment of unending crisis in which a new form of nationalism threatens all of the humane and liberal values that we inherit from Wilson, from Wilbur, from Perelman, and from the entirety of Library of America. The antidote for that kind of nationalism is not indifference to the nation. It is exactly the kind of patriotism that is always and necessarily transitive with cosmopolitanism. there's nothing in my life that makes me prouder than being involved with the Library of America. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Adam. Farah Jasmine Griffin is Williams B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia University, where she was the inaugural chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies. Her 9 books include, most recently, Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature, and In Search of a Beautiful Freedom, New and Selected Essays. For Library of America, she has edited a volume of novels by Ann Petry, the subject of her remarks tonight. Ann Petry, The Street and the Narrows, is kept permanently in print by a new gift made in the past week from Mark and Lisa Crossy, who are here tonight, to the Guardians of American Letters Fund. Thanks to their generosity, the Petry volume will stand as a lasting testimony to her achievement. And now, please welcome Farah Jasmine Griffin.
Good evening. I am also a Philadelphian, and so it's hard for me to hear Skip cheering for the Celtics. I grew up and the Celtics were not the team to cheer for in Philadelphia. I had the pleasure of editing the Ann Petry Library of America volume, and I jumped at the opportunity to do so because I am a Petry evangelist. She remains one of my favorite authors, and she is an author I believe is one of the best writers our nation has produced, and yet one who remains little known. She's constantly discovered and rediscovered. So the opportunity to introduce her to a broader readership and to secure her place and stature in our literary history continues to be of utmost importance to me. The publication of her first novel, The Street, in 1946 brought critical acclaim and a degree of literary celebrity. It's set in wartime Harlem. It's her most famous novel, the most famous novel of an unfamous writer. It's the story of Ludi Johnson, a beautiful single mother who strives to leave domestic service for more lucrative employment. Her idea of success is inspired by Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, by an Italian immigrant shopkeeper, and her wealthy white employers, all of whom encourage her to work hard, save money, and create a better life for herself in the quote-unquote best country in the world. But each of these mentors, unfortunately, fails to warn her of the pitfalls and the obstacles that await her as a working-class Black woman in a pre-Brown versus Board of Education America, in a Jim Crow America. She is under surveillance constantly by a predatory neighbor. She is stalked by her building superintendent. She is watched, cultivated, and trapped like prey by the owner of her apartment building, who also owns the club where she hopes to work. She has nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The Street became the first novel by a Black woman to sell more than 1 million copies. It was always in print. It never went out of print. It was published in several paperback editions, translated into French, Spanish, Portuguese, German. Its author appeared on magazine covers and glossy feature articles in magazines. But around the time, just as her literary celebrity grew, it was the same time as the specter of the second Red Scare began to rise, and Petry and her husband returned to Old Saybrook, Connecticut, in 1947, which is where she's from. She's a native New Englander. She grew up in Old Saybrook. They purchased a home, and she avoided celebrity, avoided publicity, except as it directly related to her writing. Some of this insistence on her privacy, I think, came from a desire to protect herself, but also, I think, because her New York years had been filled with leftist friends and colleagues, And she despised the kind of anti-communist fervor that swept the nation in the 1950s. Although she had never been a member of the Communist Party, she actually was a member of the Republican Party, as were many African Americans prior to Roosevelt, because it was the party of Lincoln. But she despised the anti-communist fervor that swept the nation. She was openly supportive of Paul Robeson. And her third novel, which I think is her most ambitious novel and is collected in the Library of America volume, The Narrows, which was published in 1953, is set in a small Connecticut city, articulates her disdain for McCarthyism. I think it's very courageous that it articulates her disdain for McCarthyism, which she says hunts, in the protagonist says, hunts both communist and Negroes. The Narrows is ostensibly the story of a tragic love affair between the married Camilla Sheffield, who is a white socialite and heiress, daughter of the town's wealthiest family and heir to the Treadway munitions fortune, and Link Williams, who is a kind of Robeson-esque figure, a scholar athlete who is a graduate of Dartmouth's and a son of the town's black community. He's, beloved by the town's black community, which is known as the Narrows. That's the name of the community. His name is Link Williams. When Link tries to end their relationship, Camillo falsely accuses him of rape. He is arrested, released on bail, but eventually kidnapped and murdered by her husband and her mother. Now, the narrative is driven forward by this love affair. It's what makes people want to read it. It's a very cinematic story. But actually, the novel just uses the relationship as a vehicle for Petry to force a confrontation between a number of opposing elements within the narrative. Yes, most obviously between black and white, but even more important, between different classes of people. It offers a critique of racism, but also a stinging critique of class, especially a critique of the market-driven society on the press, on the police, and most importantly, on an individual's conception of themselves. The Narrows is an eloquent statement of both her anti-racist and her anti-capitalist politics. Furthermore, the interracial relationship, which is at the novel's center, is an exploration of only one form of taboo sexuality. The Narrows also presents us with other considerations of sexuality. There is an openly gay character in the novel, a kind of explicitly homosexual relationship. There are also women who are openly sexual here, both black women and white women. She explores a kind of multidimensional sense of sexuality. And I think that there are all these elements that lands the book on the list of banned books. Yes, this also was a time of banned books. So it landed on the list of banned books for the National Association for Decent Literature, which was called the NODL. And in 1956, the American Civil Liberties Union issued a statement on censorship activity by private organizations and the National Organization for Decent Literature. And it noted that the NDOL was the most prominent, influential, and successful of a number of organizations engaged in censorship activity. And Petry was one of 160 prominent writers who signed the statement against book banning and censorship at the time. So all of this is the context in which her novel came out, but I think it's also the context in which she retreated. It's a context in which she, kind of didn't want to be publicly known for anything other than her writing. So it's nurtured, that sort of privacy, I think, is nurtured by her own sensibilities. She refused to reveal her personal life to reporters and to scholars as alike, believing that if she had to choose, she would choose to be known as a writer and not as a celebrity, and she felt that these concepts were fundamentally incompatible to her. She described the hoopla that surrounded the publication of The Street as turning her into public property, and that phrase pops up again and again and again in her private writings. So as late as 1996, a half-century after the first novel appeared, she told a writer, and this quotation I think is so meaningful, she told an interviewer, and I quote, "Continuous public exposure, though it may make you a personality, can diminish you as a person. To be a willing accomplice to the invasion of your own privacy puts a low price on its worth. The creative processes are or should be essentially secret, and although naked flesh is now an open commodity, the naked spirit should have sanctuary." This is a quotation that I return to again and again, and it seems so foreign in our day and time when there is just the desire to be celebrity, especially with social media, where everyone seeks the limelight. And yet I cannot help to think that there is wisdom in it if in fact it might be one of the reasons that we know so little of her and requires her to be discovered again and again. But I think that Petry's writing is as much a source of this kind of wisdom as it is for its beauty, which is why I'm so grateful that we have it in this volume. And for this reason, I return to her again and again and again. And if you haven't read her, I invite you to do so as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Farah. Suzanne Vega's critically acclaimed songs have been international chart toppers, including her distinctive and instantly recognizable classics, Marlene on the Wall, Luca, and Tom's Diner. She has released 9 studio albums, among them Lover Beloved, Songs from an Evening with Carson McCullers, based on the one-woman play Carson McCullers Talks About Love, which she co-wrote and starred in. Her book, The Passionate Eye, collects lyrics, poems, and journalism. Her other credits include being, for many years, a Library of America subscriber. Please welcome Suzanne Vega.
Thank you.
I want to say how thrilled I am to be invited to attend this event by the Library of America. I love what you do, and you are so important to the culture of America and its ongoing curation. Just want to say that right away. So I'll speak for a few minutes about my longstanding love for the great Southern writer Carson McCullers. I was attending Barnard College, studying English literature and theater. I was given an assignment of choosing a person who was no longer alive from the world of the arts and come in the next day dressed as that person and ready to answer questions as though I were on TV. I worked many jobs back then, and one was an assistant librarian, where I put books back on the shelves after they had been borrowed if I wasn't sitting on the floor reading them. So this was in the 1970s, and the wonderful biography of Carson McCullers by Virginia Spencer Carr had just been released. So I was struck by the portrait on the cover. It was a tall, boyish girl with blunt-cut bangs, a little jacket, a Brooks Brothers shirt with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. So I remembered this image and sought out the book. I had only read one piece of writing by Carson McCullers at that time. It was called Sucker. It was a short story. And it was a story of 2 boys. One seeks the love and friendship of the other one, who treats him badly and calls him Sucker. Over the course of the story, the tide turns the other way. I thought it was a great story. I couldn't wait to read more of this guy, Carson McCullers, whoever he was. But here she was on the cover of this 700-page biography. So I took the book out of the library and read as much as I could overnight. I picked out a little jacket and bought a pack of cigarettes and swaggered into class the next morning, ready to field questions. So her gin-drinking, smoking, bisexual persona was heady stuff for a 19-year-old. And I ended up writing a half-an-hour, one-woman show with 5 songs as my senior thesis back in 1981, based on her life and her work. This was way before my first record deal. So this was a project I visited and revisited throughout the decades. The play Carson McCullers Talks About Love came out in 2011. I rewrote the whole thing, and the final version of the play was called Lover Beloved, and that had its premiere in 2018 in Houston, Texas, and it has now been made into a film directed by Michael Tully in 2019. And I have always found Carson McCullers to be a singularly modern sensibility, regardless of what era I was working in. I love her for her compassion, her empathy, her eye for detail, especially regarding children. And I love her for her unsentimentality. I love her for her prescient vision of the civil rights era back in 1940. In The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, published when she was only 23 years old. I love her because she was tough and yet so fragile and needy and sometimes cruel in her private life. And we need her work today more than ever. And now I'd like to amuse you, hopefully. I'm going to pretend that this song is actually a dramatic monologue. And I'm going to tell you all about her feelings about other writers of her generation, and especially about Harper Lee. So this is meant to be a tribute, and even though Carson McCullers could be very, very shy and very humble, she could also be amazingly, she sang her own praises very well. So I'd like to do that for you now. Virginia Woolf, she leaves me cold. I recognize the genius, but I'm twice as bold. I have more to say than Hemingway. And Lord knows, compared to Faulkner, I say it in a better way. Graham Greene, he loves me. He loves my poetic sensibility. Catherine Ann Porter might be the best one now, but in about a year, I'm gonna show her how. Yes, I will. I said to Reeves the other day, Proust really is the man. He comforts me in a way no other writer can. The timeless quality of the work, the length is very long. Believe me, Marcel Proust goes on and on and on and on for 7 volumes. Now, Harper, Lee, she only wrote that one book. I've written more than 3. Darling Tennessee Williams, it's anybody's guess why a Streetcar made millions and Wedding so much less. I will forever be pondering that one. Oh, Harper, Lee. Why do they always compare her to me? To me. Won't even talk about Eudora Welty. As for F. Scott, my sad cafe is greater than his Gatsby. I'm just telling you what someone told me they read, because I never look at my reviews. They might give me the big head. Now, Truman Capote was hypnotized, mesmerized, because he realized that I knew that he had plagiarized my cadences. Imagine his surprise. You'll see it in his eyes when I win that Nobel Prize. I shall be humble and gracious. Harper, Lee. Why do they always compare her to me? To me. She always seems to be receiving more than she deserves. Honey, she's poaching on my literary preserves. Yes, from Harper Lee, we have seen and we have heard. And I'd like to kill more than just that mockingbird. You know, sometimes I really would. So you just wait until next year. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Suzanne. Beginning with her 1976 debut, The Woman Warrior, subtitled Memoirs of a Childhood Among Ghosts, Maxine Hong Kingston's audacious and imaginative storytelling transformed American autobiography, the American family memoir, and American writing more broadly. Along the way, claiming Asian American history and experience for American literature, and opening a path for the many writers who have followed. Hua Hsu wrote in The New Yorker, "The Woman Warrior changed American culture." A Library of America volume devoted to her writing, edited by Viet Thanh Nguyen, was released last year, volume number 355 in the series, with publication support from Elena Ang Lim, who is also joins us tonight, her husband Randy Lim, and their sons Justin and Jordan Lim, in memory of Elena's grandmother, Ao Shi Eng, who was born in 1899 in Chulin Village in China and died in Seattle, Washington. With its publication, Kingston is one of only 4 living writers in the Library of America series. Please welcome her.
Good evening. I discovered Thoreau when I was a kid. And I say I discovered him because this was not a school assignment. I found him for myself. And this was a time when I read for how to do anything. And to this day, the genre of how-to books is one of my favorites. And from Walden, I learned that it's okay to live on as little money as possible. I learned that it was okay to dress in homemade clothes. And I learned that it's good to raise our own food in our backyard. And my earliest, happiest memory was looking at the snow peas grow, and especially the flowers of all kinds of purples and violets. And so that's Thoreau with the beans, the same thing. And when I got older, I wanted to build my own little house. And Thoreau called it a box, so I wanted a box. And the first box was a shed in our backyard. And we kids went in there, and I put in curtains and furniture, took out all the junk, and so that became my box. And then I was thinking, what did Thoreau do in his box? I don't think that was in Walden, and so, but then it must be that he was writing in there, because that's what I wanted to do when I got into my box. And so the next box I made was I went into the house and I emptied the pantry. We had a walk-in pantry, and so I got a typewriter, and I got a table, chair, and there I started writing novels and stories. And so what I have now is, instead of a garage, we built I didn't know what to call it. Mostly I was calling it an office, and then my friends, my artist friends, were calling theirs a studio. So I tried to call mine a studio, but that didn't work, and a box doesn't work. And so since I live in California, casita. So I have a casita, and it is just the same size as Thoreau's box. And so the reading How to Live, I tried to live like Thoreau, but I loved Walden, and so okay, I'm gonna write like that. That kind of it's prose, but to me, it's poetry. Okay, then when I was older and read Walden again, which I have read it again and again at different times of my life, and the next thing I learned as an older person, that I must, when I find work, it has to be meaningful work. I cannot, I cannot do any job that has a wrong, unethical product. And so the job that I found that is meaningful is teaching school, and to be a teacher. And so most of my working life has been teaching high school. And Thoreau said that he loved a broad margin to his life. And I could think of that to mean many things, that he wanted to be far away from other people. He wanted to find solitude. He wanted to be in the woods and not the city. But, you know, he never could get away. He could not get away from human problems. Even in the woods, he could hear military martial music coming from Concord. And he knew what he said was, my fellow citizens are rallying for war against Little Mexico. And that's why he refused to pay his taxes. That tax was for war against Mexico. And we know now that that war with Mexico reverberates to this day, and we are living the consequences today. And now I understand when he says he wants a broad margin to his life. Margin, that's another word for border. Thoreau, when he went to jail for not paying his taxes, he gave me strength when I myself went to jail to protest shock and awe against Iraq. I was older when I read Emerson, and I had read the small essays. I read the Oversoul. I read Self-Reliance, and And I was so impressed by them, those 2 essays, and also by Walden, that when I registered for school at Berkeley, in those days, you had to write down what your religion was. So I looked at the form, tried to fill it out, and religion, and so I wrote transcendentalist. So I only read the selected Emerson only a few years ago, and it was not the Library of America's volume. It was the Modern Library edition. And I read that because Toni Morrison sent it to me. And she sent it after the big fire in California, the big one in Oakland and Berkeley. And it burned my neighborhood, the forest, our house. It burned the writing I was doing. And then Tony, it burned my library. I think we had like 5,000 books or so. And Toni Morrison sent me the collected Emerson. And so I was reading about he wrote about actual communion with God in oneself. He wrote about having direct experience, that's his word, experience of the spiritual and the mystical. He wrote about the universal mind. And as I was reading, I thought, wait a minute, this is the Dalai Lama. He sounds just like the Dalai Lama. The words, the translation from the Tibetan. And I thought, wow. I had earlier in learning about the transcendentalists, there was such an emphasis on self-reliance, and there's this thought about self-reliance. That's why we Americans are such individualists. But I don't think that was what Thoreau and Emerson, I don't think that's what he was talking about. I don't think he was talking about that we should be individuals. I think he was saying that we don't need an intermediary between us and God. We can have a direct experience with the universal mind on our own. That's just like the Dalai Lama, that we can individually reach Satori. Somebody else can't give it to us. And also another way he was like the Dalai Lama, Emerson talked a lot about form and how form can appear and disappear. This is like the Heart Sutra, where there is no form, there is emptiness. And Emerson said that there is a God that's within us. He called it one man with a capital O and a capital M. And he says that we are all connected to all. We are all connected to all. We are one. There isn't just me, there's all. And this is exactly what the Dalai Lama says. We are one. And so Thoreau taught me to be and to live in the real, actual, solid, physical, natural world. He also gave me the title for my long poem, I Love a Broad Margin to My Life. But Emerson taught me and affirmed my life in the mystical, the supernatural, the spiritual world, the soul world. He used that word soul again and again, sometimes with a capital S and sometimes with a small s. And so Emerson taught me soul, and that I have one and we have one, and we are the universal soul. And here is what Thoreau says on the library walk in concrete and brass. Books are the treasured wealth of the world and the fit inheritance of generations and nations. Thank you.
Maxine, thank you. Our final speaker, Tony Kushner, is one of the most extraordinarily gifted playwrights of this or any generation. Like O'Neill and Williams before him, he is constantly breaking new thematic and stylistic ground, and like Arthur Miller, he is constantly redefining what it means to be a political playwright for our place and time. Among his many honors are the Pulitzer Prize for Drama for Angels in America and the National Medal of the Arts from President Obama. A Library of America trustee since 2010, he has edited for the series a definitive 3-volume edition of Arthur Miller's plays and is developing a forthcoming edition of John Guare's. Oh yeah, in his spare time, he collaborates as a screenwriter on 4 films with Steven Spielberg, most recently The Fabelmans. Tony Kushner.
I'm going to make this very brief. I think the first time that I really became aware of the Library of America was in the mid-90s. I had this big revelation about Eugene O'Neill, who I hated for a long time and then realized was the best of the best. So I bought the 3 volumes of the Library of America's collected works of Eugene O'Neill and carried them with me everywhere. On vacation, my husband got very angry at me because they were following me everywhere. I was writing, had the idea of writing a screenplay. My agent, Brian Ciparella, is sitting right here, and he will attest to the fact that the screenplay is now 27 years overdue. But someday I'll finish it. So, oh God, I mean, I was going to read something that I wrote for the National Theater's production many years ago of Morning Becomes Electra. When I finished this and sent it to the National, one of the people on the staff called me and said that she thought that I should know that they had opened the box office that day, and the first person in line asked for tickets for the play Maureen Becomes a Lecturer. Everybody said so many amazing, okay. Much that an American playwright needs to know, I'll be very, very fast. Much that an American playwright needs to know can be learned by studying Eugene O'Neill's life and work. He read a lot, he sailed the ocean, and he suffered. His income went up and down and was never reliable. His reputation went up and down and was also unreliable. He avoided the film industry entirely. He also avoided rehearsals as much as he could. Productions of his work caused him to despair, but he kept writing. He worked very, very hard. He gave up heavy drinking early on and was mostly abstemious, disciplined. He exercised. He wrote his plays in longhand. He took his time. He followed the news. He was politically brave. He wrote of the self and also of the world. He wrote for the stage and also for publication. He was theatrical. He was dialectical. He cultivated a public image. He kept his figure. He made friends with a few important critics. He married someone who believed in his work. Winning big prizes did not protect him from savage assault. He argued with God. He hid from the world. He knew he had a soul. He exhorted himself to write better, dig deeper, and he did. There are several good biographies of O'Neill. His was the sort of life that lends itself beautifully to biography. Epic, crammed full of astonishing and satisfying narrative incident, triumphs, calamities, horrible tragedy, spiritual darkness, meanness, lunacy, courage. His character was huge and contradictory and well chronicled. A small crowd of remarkable people intersected with the largely antisocial playwright, Emma Goldman, John Reed, Robert Edmund Jones, Paul Robeson, George G. Nathan, Sean O'Casey, Hart Crane, and unhappily for O'Neill, Charlie Chaplin, who married O'Neill's daughter. He was a Titan, he was a Promethean, he wanted to be Promethean, and he was. O'Neill's was one of the important voices of his age. He articulated its ambiguities and plumbed its depths, and did so through a medium that was, before he seized hold of it, almost entirely successful at resisting depth and ambiguity, the American theater. It is not excessive to write that O'Neill created serious American drama. He was the scion of what had come before, the sensational historical narrative novelistic melodrama, a flashpot and sheet metal theater of noise and exclamation. And O'Neill retained a vestigial fondness for the exclamation mark until the end of his writing life. Long Day's Journey into Night is loaded with them. His father perfectly embodied the grandeur of that early tradition and its corruption and desiccation, as well in the brawl of the American marketplace. American theater, as incarnated by James O'Neill, presented the sun with an edible target writ large, practically begging to be taken down, overturned, slain at the crossroads. Of course, O'Neill's theatrical DNA has 19th century melodrama molecules in it. Whose hasn't? For all of his and our effort to forge ahead, less time has passed and less distance has been gained than we like to think. If you read all 50 of Eugene O'Neill's plays, from the early short dramas and comedies he wrote before and during his enrollment in George Pierce Baker's English 47 Playwrights Workshop at Harvard, to the sea plays and the first full-length dramas, on through the protean experiments with form, the daring investigations of forbidden content, the dogged pursuit of elusive meaning, you will watch American playwriting crack its eggshell and struggle free, struggle being the operative and appropriate word, free of an era in America in which all that was expected of theater was that it lie effectively, not convincingly. O'Neill's body of work is not shapely, few such bodies are. His struggles wore him to a frazzle, killed him probably, and marred and marked his writing. In his short story, The Old System, Saul Bellow invokes something he calls the demon in charge of the special ugliness of America. I think that demon's principality is the new, the fierce, ungainly struggle is its heartbeat. It has been said that O'Neill spent a lifetime writing failed plays before he got it right. He wrote 49 plays and perhaps only one great play, but that was great enough to be worth the wait. 49 plays to forge a path through the wilderness for his descendants to follow, 49 plays that lay the groundwork for serious American drama, and then one indisputably great play nestled securely in the pantheon of world literature, dramatic and otherwise. O'Neill knew that it was his best play, even though he tried to have it hidden from public view until 25 years after his death, and stated clearly in his will that it ought never to be performed on stage. Imagine that. His widow's betrayal of his wishes, whatever else it might be, must be seen as by us as an act of the greatest beneficence. O'Neill must have known that it was very great, great in a way that nothing he'd written was, great in a way little else written for the theater was. But it's a grave disservice to O'Neill's monumental accomplishment to view the rest of his work as mere prelude and extended vamp towards Long Day's Journey. The first plays are messy, even embarrassing, but the authority and audacity of an important writer are there at the awkward beginning. Deeply influenced by Hauptmann and Synge and Jesus Christ, the writer O'Neill settled at once among the poor, the despised, and the outcast. Inheritor of a theater grown sluggish with nostalgia and fuzzy pseudo-historical romance, he wrote with obstreperous ugliness and a kind of carnal glee about abortion, prostitution. Like Gladstone, from whom he was named, he was much preoccupied with prostitutes, class, murder, and suicide. A few others had engaged this way with the downside of American life, some long before O'Neill began, and he certainly had his contemporaries. But O'Neill was seeking, almost from the beginning of his career, to move beyond empathy, compassion, and outrage to something else, seeking some tremendous meaning he discerned, beckoning vaguely on the other side of emotion and intellect. All such pursuits risk pretentiousness, clunky poetry, dramaturgical and aesthetic disaster, of which O'Neill delivered a generous portion. He was a writer-explorer in the tradition of Herman Melville, one of the first and foremost of America's seafaring mythifiers, for whom, as with O'Neill, the ocean is a vast incubatory of metaphor. Melville's prayer from Marty might have been O'Neill's own. Fiery yearnings their own phantom future make, and deem it present. So, if after all these fearful fainting trances, the verdict be, the golden haven was not gained, yet, in bold quest thereof, better to sink in boundless deeps than float on vulgar shores, and give me, ye gods, an utter wreck, if wreck I do. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to our extraordinary speakers tonight, to our amazing board, to my colleagues, the brilliant Library of America team, and to all of you for your support and your partnership, and have a wonderful evening.